The survey chart for VETH-4 interior ravine system used the designation unverified, approach with assessment, which Cale Doran had learned over 7 years of expedition work, was the cartographic community's way of saying we sent someone to the edge, looked in, and decided someone else could sort out the details. The designation was not a deterrent. It was an invitation to the specific category of person who found unverified more interesting than mapped, and Cale was that category of person, which was one of the reasons Verath Expedition Services kept renewing his contract despite his consistent failure to describe routes as anything other than what they actually were. He was at the ravine's second bend, conducting the approach assessment that the chart had requested, when he found her. She was in the specific, organized state of someone who had been in a bad situation for long enough to have arranged the bad situation into the best available version of itself. Her injured leg stabilized with material from her pack, her remaining water rationed to what the calculus of conscious maintenance required, her position in the ravine's shaded section chosen for temperature management rather than comfort. She had been there since the previous evening. Her communications equipment was destroyed, a fall damage pattern he recognized from the angle of the debris, and her group, wherever they were, either did not know her precise location or did not have the specific capability to extract from this terrain, which were two different problems with two different solutions, and neither of them immediate. He conducted his injury assessment with the thoroughness the situation warranted and arrived at the following inventory: broken left leg, fibula, and possibly the smaller of the two adjacent structures, field stabilized adequately. Dehydration, significant but not yet critical, manageable with the water he was carrying. No head injury per the standard assessment protocol, she responded to with the patient compliance of someone who had been waiting for qualified assistance and was cooperating fully. "You were attempting the ravine solo," he said. "This was not a question." "I was," she said. "This section is designated unverified," he said. "I had the chart," she said. "The chart says approach with assessment," he said. "It doesn't say proceed without backup and communications redundancy." "You are correct," she said, in the tone of someone who was not arguing and was also not performing contrition she didn't feel, simply acknowledging the accurate statement as accurate, which was a specific quality he noted and filed. He looked at the terrain between their current position and base camp. He looked at his team's load distribution and made the relevant calculation. He looked at the daylight window. 17 kilometers to base camp, he said. 9 hours given the terrain. My team carries your pack, I carry you. We move now to make the window. I can contribute, she began. With a broken leg in this topography, he said, your contribution is remaining conscious and not shifting your weight unexpectedly. I'll tell you when I need the second one. She looked at him. All right, she said. He redistributed the load across his team with the efficiency of someone who had done this calculation before, not with this specific terrain or this specific injured person, but the underlying math was consistent, and he had run it often enough that the variables were the interesting part rather than the process. He got her into the carry position. He started walking. The terrain in the ravine's middle section had the specific quality of terrain that had never been organized for human passage, which was the quality of most terrain on Class 3 wilderness planets, and which was the quality Cale found specifically interesting about this work. Every step was a negotiation rather than a transaction, the rock offering what it offered and requiring you to assess rather than assume, the route emerging through reading rather than following. She was conscious throughout, which was what he needed and what the situation required and what she had apparently determined was her contribution. Earth has wilderness rescue traditions, she said, at approximately the 40-minute mark. Not a question, an opening, the specific kind that indicated interest rather than small talk. Several thousand years of them, he said. More if you count the older traditions that weren't called rescue. What were they called? Just going back for the people who didn't make it back, he said. The naming came later. The practice came first. She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone absorbing something. That's a better origin story than most traditions have, she said. It's accurate, he said. Most good traditions are. They talked. The talking was the specific, honest kind that emerged when two people had a long task ahead of them, and nothing to do except the task. Not the curated conversation of people managing an impression, but the natural conversation of people who were moving through something difficult together, and were using language the way it was originally for, to make the moving through less solitary. She asked about Earth's terrain traditions with the careful, specific curiosity of someone who was genuinely interested in the answers, not performing interest in a subject to fill time. She asked follow-up questions that indicated she had been following at the level where the follow-up questions were the right ones. "What made you choose this work?" she said, at the 2-hour mark, when they had climbed out of the ravine's lower section and were on the ridge traverse. "It found me," he said, "or I found it by not finding the other things." "What other things?" "The ones that looked like what I was supposed to do," he said. "I had 2 years in logistics coordination, 1 year in resource survey, 8 months in construction assessment. Each of them had the right parts and the wrong shape." He navigated a section where the ridge narrowed and required focus rather than conversation, and then picked it back up when the footing widened. "The first expedition contract I took was supposed to be a gap between the construction assessment and something that was going to be the right shape. Turned out the gap was the right shape." 7 years, she said. 7 years, he said. "And the parts that are right," she said, "what are they?" He thought about it, not performing the consideration, actually thinking about the question in the honest way, because it was a good question, and it deserved the honest answer. "The reading," he said. "Terrain you haven't been in before requires reading rather than navigation. You're not following a path, you're finding one. That's the right shape." She was quiet for a moment. "You're describing something that's also true of other things," she said. "Most true things are also true of other things," he said. "That's one of the ways you can tell." He heard something in her that was not quite a laugh, the contained version of one, the version that arrived when something was genuinely funny or genuinely right, and the expression was involuntary rather than performed. He filed this, not because it was operationally relevant, but because he had been filing things since the ravine and had not examined why. "What were you looking for in the ravine system?" he said. "Unmapped terrain," she said. "That's the destination, not the reason," he said. She looked at the landscape, or as much of the landscape as was visible from the carry position, which was a constrained view, but she was making the most of it with the attention of someone for whom attention was a practice rather than a reflex. "Places that haven't been interpreted yet," she said, "before the frameworks arrive. There's a quality to them that changes when the documentation comes, not worse, not always, but different. The place becomes what the documentation says it is rather than what it is." She paused. "I find the before more interesting." "That's also true of people," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He navigated a descent that required the full focus of his attention and both hands on the terrain features he was using for stability. And she did the thing he had asked her to do, which was remain still and not shift her weight unexpectedly. And she did it well, which was the quality of someone who understood that there were moments when the best contribution was to stop being a variable. "You were traveling solo," he said, when the descent was done and the footing was level enough for conversation again. "In unverified terrain, on a Class 3 planet." "I was," she said, "with a communication setup that didn't have redundancy." "There were redundancies," she said, with the first note of something that was not quite rueful. "They were in the pack I left with my group." He absorbed this. "You separated from your group on purpose," he said. "I intended a short solo assessment of the ravine's entry section," she said. "The entry section was more extensive than the chart suggested." He thought about unverified, approach with assessment. "I'm going to put that in the survey update," he said. "The entry section being more extensive than charted, under hazards." That seems appropriate, she said. I'm also going to note that the Class 3 designation should include a recommendation against solo assessment without communications redundancy. That's also appropriate, she said. I have opinions about expedition planning that doesn't account for Class 3 hazard margins, he said. I usually keep them to myself when someone's in the carry position because it seems like the wrong time. But you could express them now, she said. I had 14 hours before you arrived to develop my own version. Yours might be useful for comparison. He expressed them. He did it in the plain way he expressed opinions about things he had spent 7 years developing opinions about, not lecturing, not performing expertise, just saying what he thought about the specific categories of wilderness mismanagement that produced the specific categories of extraction situations he had been in. She listened with the full attention she had been listening with the whole time, and asked the occasional question that indicated she was following at the level of the logic rather than the surface, and did not argue with the parts he was right about, and offered a quiet, specific correction on the one part where his assumption about the hazard category was slightly off. He noted the correction. You know the hazard classification system, he said. I've read the framework, she said. Most people who have read the framework don't use it to correct a guide mid-extraction, he said. Most people would be right not to, she said. You are almost right, which is different from wrong. Almost right is the beginning of right, he said. Yes, she said. That's also a thing that's true of other things. Kilometer 11 was where the ridge system joined the plateau, and the terrain opened from the specific, enclosed quality of the ravine traverse into the larger, more navigable quality of the plateau's upper approach. Wider footing, better sight lines. The base camp's general direction visible in the way that general directions were visible when you knew what you were looking for. He had been carrying her for 6 hours at kilometer 11, and was in the specific, functional exhaustion of someone who had been doing difficult physical work for 6 hours, and was going to continue doing it for 3 more hours because the work required it, and the work was what he was here for. He said something about the plateau's topology that he had been thinking for the last 20 minutes, which was that the chart was wrong about the drainage pattern, that the water moved toward the eastern section rather than the western, and that the survey update was going to require a significant correction in that section. The eastern ridge has a lower profile at the secondary junction, she said. The water would follow the elevation gradient. He looked at the ridge she was describing, which he had been looking at without fully looking at because he had been navigating the approach. She was right. You've been reading the terrain, he said. I've had a good view, she said, and time. He looked at the drainage pattern and the ridge profile and the secondary junction, and at the chart on his secondary display, which was showing the incorrect version, and he thought about someone with a broken leg in a carry position conducting a landscape assessment for the better part of 6 hours. He said something about it. He said it in the specific, genuine way of someone who was responding to something that was genuinely what it was, which was a person doing careful, useful work in circumstances that did not require the work, and in which the work was entirely her own choice. She laughed. Not the contained version, the genuine one, the involuntary one, the one that arrived when something landed exactly right in the specific place where things landed exactly right, which was the place that produced the real version rather than the performed version. It was a short laugh, and then it was the aftermath of the laugh, which in her case was the specific, open quality of something having come through the managed exterior that had been containing it. And he heard both and noted both and kept walking because they had 3 hours left, and the window was what the window was. What, he said. Nothing, she said. You said something correctly. I say things correctly with some regularity, he said. You do, she said. It is notable. He navigated the plateau's first section, with the focus it required. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was looking at something. The productive quiet of someone whose attention was occupied rather than the quiet of someone who had run out of things to say. The survey update, she said, at kilometer 12. The drainage correction and the entry section hazard notation. How long before it's in the system? 30 days to processing, usually, he said. Faster if the chart maintenance team flags it as safety relevant. The hazard notation would flag it, she said. Probably, he said. Are you going to be back in this terrain before 30 days? She was quiet for a moment. Not in this specific terrain, she said. He heard the specific quality of that answer, which was the quality of an answer that was accurate, and was also not the full version of what it was accurate about. And he filed it in the same place he had been filing things since the ravine, and kept walking. They reached the base camp's perimeter at the end of the daylight window, which was when he had calculated they would reach it, because the calculation had been accurate, and the execution had been what the execution had been. The medical team was staged at the camp's edge, as his communication relay had requested in hour 3. The expedition coordinator was there with the clipboard and the intake documentation, and the accident report forms that extraction situations generated. The camp was doing its end-of-day business. The support staff managing the evening tasks, the research team's second element completing their own survey day, the standard ambient activity of a functional field installation doing its work. He was mid-sentence in the handoff, injury assessment, hydration timeline, fall location coordinates for the accident report, communications equipment status, when the base camp stopped. He noticed it the way he noticed terrain changes. The ambient information changing quality rather than disappearing, the shift from background to foreground without any single element being the obvious cause. The medical technician was not completing the reach toward the intake documentation. The coordinator's clipboard was at her side and staying there. The 2 support staff members who had been crossing the camp on their respective errands were not crossing it anymore. Someone to his right had gone to their knees. He looked, not at the person on their knees. He had identified the cause of the person on their knees in the peripheral accounting before the conscious look, but at her, because she was what had produced this, and he was looking at her with the attention of someone who was seeing something for the first time that he had been seeing for 9 hours, and had apparently not been seeing correctly. She was looking at the base camp stop population with the expression he had not had a category for in the ravine, and now had context for. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for a moment, and had been not waiting for it simultaneously, and had arrived at the moment where both states were ending. That, said Expedition Coordinator Velkorath, in the voice of someone using language that was not adequate to the situation, and was using it anyway because it was what was available, is the celestial sovereign. She paused. She rules 47 systems. Kale held the woman he had been carrying for 9 hours and 17 kilometers, and looked at the base camp that had stopped and looked at her and thought about the drainage pattern she had correctly assessed from the carry position, and the hazard framework she had corrected him on, and the specific, contained laugh at kilometer 11, and the 9 hours of conversation that had been genuine in the way that conversations were genuine when neither party was managing anything. He set her down carefully. He set her down the way he had been setting her down at every position change for 9 hours, with the specific, practical care of someone moving an injured person who needed care taken with them, which was what he had been doing, and which he continued to do because the injury was the injury regardless of the 47 systems. The medical team recovered from whatever they were in and came forward, because the medical team were professionals, and the professional function was what they were there for. He gave the handoff in the plain, complete way he had been giving it before the base camp stopped. Injury assessment, hydration timeline, fall location coordinates, communications equipment status, and the medical team received it with the focused attention of people who had recovered their function and were applying it. She was transferred. She looked at him once in the transfer, with the expression he had been learning to read since the ravine and now had the context for, which did not change the expression but changed what he understood about it. The conversation request arrived 90 minutes later, delivered by the coordinator with the specific, careful quality of someone who had organized themselves back into professional function after an event that had required significant reorganization. She would like to speak with you, Velkorath said, in the medical bay, when you're ready. He was ready in the immediate sense. The survey debrief could wait. The survey notes would keep. He had been a wilderness guide for 7 years and had survived longer deferrals than a medical bay conversation. He went. She was in the bay's primary assessment section, her leg in the treatment apparatus that the field medical system provided, the hydration line doing its work. She looked like she had looked for the past 9 hours, which was, he understood this differently now than he had understood it in the ravine. The look of someone who had been herself for 9 hours and was now in the first minutes of the transition back to the version of herself that the 47 systems required. He sat in the chair beside the assessment section because the chair was there, and he had been carrying something for 9 hours and sitting was the appropriate activity. You had the expedition credentials, he said, before the ravine. Yes, she said. You knew who I was before I found you. I had reviewed the survey team's composition, she said. My group crossed the filing when we made our own entry permits. She looked at him steadily. I knew you were likely to come through the ravine given the survey route. I had approximately 8 of the 14 hours to think about what that meant. He sat with this. At any point in 9 hours, he said. At several points, she said. Kilometer 4 when you described the drainage correction. Kilometer 8 when you expressed your opinions about expedition planning. She paused. Kilometer 11. What stopped you at kilometer 11? You said something correctly, she said. In the specific way you say things correctly, which is without arrangement. She looked at the medical apparatus. I knew that if I said it at kilometer 11, what came after kilometer 11 would be different. You would manage what you said differently. You would think about what I would hear rather than saying what you thought. She looked at him. I have been in rooms and corridors and formal contexts for a very long time with very many people who think about what I will hear before they say what they think. The 9 hours were not that. I did not want to end them. He thought about this. The base camp, he said. You could have asked me to set you down at the perimeter. Yes, she said, you didn't. No, she said, I wanted you to see it. He looked at her. I wanted you to understand what the 9 hours were an alternative to, she said. I could have described it. The description would have been accurate. But you understand terrain by reading it rather than following description, and this was the same kind of reading. She looked at the medical bay's entrance, beyond which the base camp was doing the specific, ongoing work of processing what had arrived at its perimeter. That is what every interaction I have looks like. Some version of someone going to their knees or the equivalent. Everything managed, everything arranged, every word considered for consequence. She looked at him. The 9 hours were not that. He thought about 9 hours. He thought about the drainage pattern and the hazard framework and the genuine laugh at kilometer 11. He thought about someone who had described their interest in unmapped terrain as the interest in places that hadn't been interpreted yet, before the frameworks arrived, when the place was still what it was rather than what the documentation said it was. You were applying that to yourself, he said. The unmapped terrain, the before. She looked at him with the expression that was not managed. Yes, she said. You let me carry you for 9 hours without knowing who I was carrying, he said, because not knowing meant the 9 hours were honest. The 9 hours were honest, she said. Yes. The honesty was based on what I didn't know, he said. Yes, she said. I have been asking myself since kilometer 3 whether that was the honest kind of honesty. She looked at him. The answer I arrived at was that it was the honest kind if it was followed by this conversation, which is why I did not ask you to set me down at the perimeter. She paused. This conversation was always intended. The 9 hours were the beginning of it, not the whole of it. He sat with this in the specific, methodical way he sat with significant information, organizing it in the order that produced clarity, which in this case was an order that was still finding itself. The 47 systems, he said. Yes, she said. That is a significant quantity of systems. It is the quantity I have, she said, with the specific, dry quality he had heard at kilometer 11 and was hearing again, which was the quality she had when she was being herself rather than the version required by the quantity of systems. I have a survey to finish, he said. 3 days remaining. The route runs adjacent to the base camp perimeter on the second and third days. She looked at him. The debrief documentation happens in the evenings, he said. In the common space. The terrain notes, the chart corrections, the hazard updates. He looked at the medical apparatus, which was going to keep her in the bay for the first day and allow restricted movement for the second and third. The drainage correction is significant. It's going to require a substantial chart update. I would find a second assessment useful. You have your team's assessments, she said. My team didn't spend 6 hours reading the plateau from the carry position, he said. She looked at him with the expression he was going to be thinking about for the foreseeable future, the open one, the one that existed on the other side of the 47 systems, the one from kilometer 11. The second evening, she said. The medical clearance will allow it by then. Second evening, he said. Common space. The drainage correction first, it's the most significant update. I'll review the chart section before then, she said. It's in the survey file, he said. The coordinator has the access credentials. I'll have them by morning, she said, in the tone of someone for whom access to things was not typically the constraint. He stood. He looked at the bay's entrance and the base camp beyond it, which was continuing to do the specific, ongoing work of processing the evening, and which was going to be doing different work than usual tonight. He looked at her. The laugh at kilometer 11, he said. She looked at him. Was it the laugh or the almost right that produced it, he said. She looked at him with the expression for a moment before answering, which was the expression of someone deciding whether to give the accurate answer or the comfortable one. The almost right was the occasion, she said. The laugh was for the 7 years. He looked at her. You've been doing this for 7 years, she said, finding the path by reading the terrain rather than following description, saying things correctly without arrangement, carrying people out of ravines they had no business being in without requiring them to justify being in the ravines. She looked at the medical apparatus. I found someone in a Class 3 wilderness ravine who had spent 7 years becoming exactly themselves. It was notable. He stood in the medical bay in the specific, particular quality of someone who has been seen in the specific way, and is in the first moments of knowing they've been seen that way. Second evening, he said. Second evening, she said. He left the bay and walked through the base camp, which made way for him with the specific, careful quality of a base camp that had revised its understanding of the person walking through it, but did not yet know what to do with the revision. He went to his quarters. He sat with his survey notes and the chart corrections that the day had produced, which were significant and which were going to require the second assessment, and he thought about 9 hours and unmapped terrain and the before and the after. Outside, the 47 systems were doing what 47 systems did, which was continue. The vast, indifferent continuation of things that were larger than any single event, even the events that mattered. The Veth 4 wilderness was doing what it had been doing since, before the survey charter designated it Class 3, and would be doing after the survey was complete, and the documentation had interpreted it into the fixed form that documentation produced. He thought about the before. He thought about the second evening. He opened the survey notes and began the drainage correction, which was a significant update and was going to require the chart to be substantially revised, and which would be better with a second assessment from someone who had spent 6 hours reading the plateau from a vantage point he had not had. He worked until the camp's lights shifted to the evening cycle. Then he stopped and looked at the notes and at the chart, and at the specific, accumulated evidence of a day that had started with unverified, approach with assessment, and had turned out